Oh my god, I couldn't be any more excited for this episode.
I'm doubly excited.
Good, because that's appropriate. Because we are talking about Two-Face.
One of my favorite villains of all time.
And the best thing about this episode, from my perspective, is that it's the first time in the episodes that we've covered so far that we are seeing a legitimate origin story.
Mm-hmm.
So I am very excited. I know you're excited. This is part one of a two-parter. We are going to do part two next week. So let's jump into part one right now. First, let's talk about Two-Face a little bit.
Sure.
Two-Face is a character who's been around since the 40s. He was actually introduced in Detective Comics number 66. Bill Finger and Bob Kane created him. In the summer of 1942, he made his first appearance. Now, this was a character, I'll give a little bit of backstory on his origins then versus what we're going to talk about in the animated series. Two-Face was originally, well, in his first appearance, he was Harvey Kent, but it was a little too close to Clark, so he's changed to Harvey Dent. But Harvey was the district attorney who was prosecuting the mob boss, Sal Maroni, and Sal threw acid in his face, thus scarring half of his face and turning him into one of Batman's arch nemesis. At the time, he wasn't so much... he wasn't a big part of Batman's rogues gallery. In fact, he only made 3 appearances in the 40s. Mm-hmm. In his third appearance, actually, he was cured. His scarring was, his disfigurement was fixed, mm-hmm. and he was cured of his insanity, which kind of makes him a really boring villain. So we didn't see him again until the 50s. Really, he only made a couple appearances in the 50s. It wasn't until the 1970s with Denny O'Neil that he came in and actually solidified himself as a member of the Rogues Gallery. And really, it wasn't until Batman Year One, written by Frank Miller, where we get a little bit of backstory that we continue to see in Batman the Animated Series, and that is that he is good friends with both Bruce Wayne and Commissioner Gordon, mm-hmm. Which sort of makes him that much more tragic when he becomes a villain, and now Batman and Commissioner Gordon are having to go after their old friend.
Right.
And then after Year One, Andrew Helfer, the writer, actually introduced sort of an alcoholic and abusive father in Harvey's past, and there was even mentions of early kind of struggles with, there was paranoia, and there was even bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. All of that we can certainly get into as we go on, mm-hmm. which we can do now. This episode was the 10th mm-hmm. In the two-parter. It was the 10th episode, first aired September 25th, 1992. When we're introduced to Harvey, it's actually through a nightmare.
Right. The episode opens up with this dark scene. Harvey is alone, sort of distraught. He's hearing this voice.
Harvey Dent.
And we start to see the signature coin flip. At the time, it's not signature to us if we're going by the episode.
Right, we've not seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
But in this dream, he approaches this dark figure who's in the shadows. You can't really quite make out who he is, but you see this hand come out and he flips a coin, and apparently that gesture is, incredibly frightening to Harvey.
You can't get away from me.
He wakes up from his dream and he's just sweating, he wakes up in this panic attack. He's completely distressed and distraught by this dream. Yeah,
so we find out through, I don't know if it's his personal assistant or his campaign manager. He sort of seems to have job descriptions of both. But this gentleman comes in, tells Harvey that they're going on a raid. Now, why the district attorney is there for the raid, I don't really know. But the GCPD are going after these guys who are fighting back with a vengeance. They've even got rocket launchers. And Batman comes in and, of course, saves the day. But in his opportunity to get in front of the camera, Harvey, of course, praises Gotham City's police department, Commissioner Gordon especially. Harvey mentions that
I will not rest until Gotham City has been dethorned once and for all.
So you're right. He's absolutely got a great deal of pressure on him, and we start to see him break a little bit because one of the thugs, as he's being carried off in handcuffs, kicks mud onto the suit of Harvey Dent. And an otherwise jovial Harvey flips out. I mean, just loses his stuff.
You little weasel! I'll tear you apart!
Help! Get him off! He's crazy! Someone get him off me!
If you were to see someone, especially someone as public as Harvey, just go to town on a guy in handcuffs, what are you thinking?
Well, at this point, we haven't seen this before from him, but he's, one can say certainly he has anger problems, that he's irritable, that he's on edge. It's not, I would actually say it's not, abnormal to have moments of losing control, especially if someone is attacking your character and essentially, humiliating you in front of cameras in public. Harvey's public persona, his character, his morality, that's incredibly important to him. He's up for re-election. He has conviction that he is the best person for this job. And, these thugs are attacking his credibility.
Yeah, and something you just said actually brings up an interesting point. You said that they're basically laughing at him. And what we actually hear, we do sort of get the sense that that's how he perceives them. And that maybe that harkens back to an old memory or something that he has, because when he kicks the mud onto his suit, and Harvey flips out, he actually starts to hear laughter from people around him. And he specifically says, kick mud in my face, will you? Like this is something that you get the sense that he's dealt with maybe since childhood. Like there's something wrong. And I think that there's something a little telling as well. When the news report, Summer Gleason comes on and says,
"Unfortunately, Handsome Harvey earned a new nickname tonight, Hothead Harvey, when he attacked one of the suspects."
Well, certainly all of us have hot buttons, like if you tease somebody or say something to someone and it happens to be something they're very sensitive about, like somebody may, tease you about your hair color or, say something about...
In Gotham City, that means I'm a villain.
Right. If you're a ginger, apparently,
right,
you will be recruited as a villain in
right,
Gotham City. But, if someone calls you a ginger or says, something derogatory about your hair color, you may be sensitive to that because I know I'm not taking a guess at this. We've talked about this before. You have a history of this happening to you.
Sure.
Right? So similarly, someone may call me short or, say something about, being nerdy or liking math too much. I mean, whatever it may be. We all have sensitivities. And if somebody attacks you or insults you around that particular characteristic, you might be more prone to get defensive and you may want to lash out. That's completely normal.
Gotcha.
What's a little bit abnormal is the level at which he combats the guy. Like he
boils. I mean,
he attacks him.
Yeah.
And so he goes from 0 to 10 or 0 to rage in a second. That's a little bit, like I said, abnormal. That's a little bit out of the ordinary in the sense that his mood state changes so quickly.
Right.
And that would concern me. Certainly that's something that would make me pause and wonder.
Well, it doesn't just concern you. It concerns Bruce Wayne, and it concerns Harvey's fiancée, Grace. They mention a gathering, a function later. Bruce mentions...
Harvey, you didn't just lose your temper out there. You were like another person.
And it's revealed at this function that Harvey is secretly seeing a psychiatrist for this, which isn't uncommon, and it's actually encouraged. I mean, if you've got a position of power where you could literally boil over like this, you might want to get it out. Now, how it's perceived in the public eye is something entirely different, and that is very much what Harvey is concerned about, especially given that he is currently in the middle of a campaign for re-election.
Right, I think that's fairly realistic. And the show does a really cool job of, making it clear that Bruce Wayne and Harvey Dent's fiancée are accepting of Harvey receiving psychiatric help, that they're supportive of it, that they want him to get better, but that they're worried about him. And at the same time, they understand that he's in the public eye, and that this could be something that could really tarnish his reputation and could cost him his reelection. So, the show, I think, is very realistic about that, and I really admire the show for even having this dialogue about, getting help is okay.
Just out of curiosity, on a little bit of a sidebar here, because we've mentioned Grace, how long do you think this episode's been since Pretty Poison?
I know, I thought about that, because he was, absolutely in love with
Harvey's
Poison
been
Ivy.
engaged twice. That guy really wants to get married. But Grace seems to be the one. She supports him. She absolutely loves him. She's
Right.
backing him in all the right ways.
Right, and it's actually at this fundraiser where Grace and Harvey and Bruce Wayne are enjoying the event, and Carlos, Harvey's assistant, approaches him and says apparently the thugs that Harvey helped take down and get locked away were being set free.
Yes.
So clearly,
Which again sets Harvey off into another ball of rage.
right. So just hearing that information, he gets irritated and upset. He throws Carlos onto a table.
Says that the judge is on the take, just like everybody else. I mean,
Right.
yeah, it goes off.
Right.
once
Again, that elevated mood, the quickness, the rapid fluctuation of mood, and the extreme nature of his rage, that's not quite typical. That's yet another sign. It's almost like if we imagine that this is around the same time, not too long after the first one, we might even say this is part of his, initial or overall episode of being irritable.
Right.
And that's when Bruce and Grace approach him with their concern, and we find out about his psychiatrist.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they make it sound as if this is something that is brand new to them. So this isn't necessarily a personality trait that he has been showing throughout the time that he's known Bruce, and you certainly get the sense that he and Bruce Wayne have been good friends for quite a long time. This is something that really kind of seems to be sudden, and that's going to lead me into the next scene, and that is we see Harvey undergoing hypnosis therapy by his psychiatrist. For starters, let's talk a little bit about hypnosis, because I know that it's one of those therapies that's a little controversial, and certainly, if you heard last week, I'm a huge magic nerd. Even stage hypnosis is just as controversial.
Well, right, and first we need to make that distinction. There's something called hypnosis, and there's something that's hypnotherapy,
Right.
and they're actually very different techniques, and very different people are qualified to do either one.
Yeah.
So I just want to make clear that a hypnotherapist is a different, has different training than a hypnotist.
Okay.
So you have more experience with hypnotism as, as a stage technique, as a performance.
Right.
What would you say what can you share about your experiences with that?
It's one of those things that's always sort of fun to watch in a way. I mean, it's very sophomoric. I mean, you are usually watching your good friend barking like a dog or something on stage. But it's interesting. There's a world famous magician / mentalist by the name of Darren Brown, who has spent a great deal of his life as a hypnotist. Mm-hmm. And even he, in his book, Tricks of the Mind, says that he doesn't even know if hypnosis is real. I mean...
Why is that?
Because you can't really know. You can't... There's no way... He says that you basically have three categories of people. You have a person... Or you have three possibilities, rather. You've got a person who is really hypnotized. So that if I ask you to bark like a dog, you will do it because you have been told to. And then you've got the people who, they're subconscious, they want to bark like a dog. Not specifically, but they want the attention. They enjoy being on the stage, being used as an example. And even though they might not be hypnotized, they might allow themselves to think that they are. And they might go along with it, whether they're conscious of the fact that they're going along with it or not, because it's something that subconsciously they want to do. They want to participate. And then there's the third person. There's the person who is embarrassed that they are not hypnotized. And they think that the other 9 people on the stage are. And they don't want to be embarrassed in front of this large audience who may think that they aren't susceptible or that somehow they did something wrong. So they go along with it anyway, knowing that the audience will accept them, but they are very conscious of the fact that they are doing this.
They're just pretending to be hypnotized.
They are pretending because they don't want the embarrassment. Now, the thing is, and this is why Darren Brown makes the point that you never can really know, who's going to admit one way or another that they were or weren't? So, like, would that person then go, you know what, it turns out I wasn't, I was just playing along?
Right.
Or would the person who subconsciously wanted to bark like a dog admit to you, his friend or her friend, you know what, I totally wanted to be a part of this. You just can't really know if what you're doing. All you know is that for those few minutes that those people are on stage, it's entertaining to everybody. But it's really hard to actually pinpoint how accurate it is.
Right. And my understanding is that everybody has a different level of suggestibility. Like
Sure.
People with a high degree of suggestibility may be more likely to be, induced into this hypnotic
and that's
state.
one of the things that Darren does is he goes and sort of looks for the people that he can control or that he can at least predict their responses to certain things. How susceptible would they be to do this or that? And he actually chooses his subjects very carefully that way. So how is that different than hypnotherapy?
Well, hypnotherapy is a type of psychotherapy that's used as a treatment for people actually who could be suffering from a number of different types of mental illnesses. So sometimes hypnotherapy is used for anxiety problems, post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes even medical disorders like asthma, sometimes cancer. So psychiatric, medical, physical, like hypnotherapy has actually been used quite a bit and has been studied, I would say not as much as other therapies, but certainly enough to show that hypnotherapy can be effective for some of these problems. It's not to say, though, I do have to add that hypnotherapy is probably one of the treatments that is, I would say, the most controversial.
Right.
And it has to actually do with what you said, in the sense that there is no neurobiological, neurochemical explanation of the hypnotic state. So for the very reason you mentioned, we have no fundamental understanding of why this therapy works. For that very reason, a lot of psychologists and mental health clinicians, myself included, believe that the component of hypnotherapy that is actually driving the treatment or is responsible for somebody getting better may not actually be that hypnotic state. It may be something that's actually more commonly found, a psychological state that a lot of us experience, like the sense of relaxation, the ability to be calm, to be in a relaxed enough state that you're able to process some of the feelings, some of the memories and experiences that you need to in order to recover.
Would you say that the hypnosis then acts a little bit like a placebo and that they believe that they're getting better? Or
I wouldn't call it a placebo because there's something about the technique that seems to be effective.
Yeah.
But I get what you're saying. Like, do they think because they're hypnotized they're getting better?
Right.
Not necessarily, and I'm not sure I have an answer to that. But because we may simply not know. But a lot of those in the mental health field believe that it's not that these patients are in a special state. You know, they're actually in a normal psychological state. For people with active imaginations, like I said, a high degree of suggestibility, the motivation to want to change, those are very normal states. And it's perhaps in that state, in addition to the ability to use guided imagery, relaxation techniques, calming techniques, breathing techniques with an expert, that might allow them to be able to process their problems, I would say, in a way that they're able to get better. So that's for me the best explanation of how hypnotherapy works.
And then we've got what Harvey actually goes in for, and something that seems to be at the height of controversy in hypnotherapy, and that is something like repressed anger, a repressed memory, or whatever. Talk a little bit about hypnotherapy used to bring those sorts of things to the surface.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because a lot more research has gone into the effectiveness of hypnotherapy to retrieve repressed memories and to help patients to recover these memories, especially if they're traumatic. You know, so think of people that have been abused, that have been sexually abused, that have been victimized, and they can't remember what happened to them. A lot of times, hypnotherapists and other experts will try, the hypnotherapy technique to try to retrieve these memories. And it's interesting. I'm just going to actually read this from a research study because it's actually now pretty well known in this field that hypnotherapy actually retrieves false memories more than it retrieves real memories.
So this sort of goes back to what we were dealing with the episode POV, where memory might actually be faulty.
Right. So I'll read straight from this article. Memory retrieval often results in symptomatic improvement. However, retrieved memories are likely to be distorted, and in some research studies, hypnotized subjects were reluctant to admit that their memories were inaccurate, even when confronted with clear evidence demonstrating this to be the case.
You've got someone who knows for a fact, or who in their conscious knows that it's false.
Right.
But aren't willing to admit it because they believe that that this has come up.
Mm-hmm. Their conviction has become so strong.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this scene, we see Harvey's therapist put him under.
You are now in a deep sleep. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
She specifically asks, and this is where I think it gets interesting, mainly because other characters throughout the episode don't require a pendulum to do this. But she specifically asks to speak not to Harvey, but to his alter ego, Big Bad Harv.
Right.
So she is throwing in the suggestion that repressed anger and guilt from when he was a child, when he supposedly hit this bully who had been picking on him every day at school. One day he gets fed up, he hits the bully goes down, no big deal. But then that bully ends up in the hospital. Harvey believes that it's because of his punch, but really the kid had appendicitis.
Mm-hmm.
But poor Harvey felt so guilty, he never showed his anger again.
So now you're talking about a guy who was literally pent up every bit of anger he's ever had, which is impressive for a guy who's a district attorney. But, you know, now this anger is coming up in the form of Big Bad Harv. Is this sort of thing the kind of thing that you could bring up in a hypnotherapy session? And secondly, they're suggesting multiple personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that can happen? Can you have a fractured identity based on this pent-up aggression?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, according to this psychiatrist, it was the repressed anger and the extreme guilt that Harvey felt that created what this psychiatrist calls his illness. So she believes that his overwhelming guilt about the amount of anger that he felt is what is causing this sort of dichotomy, this, angry, rageful monster and this calm, logical thinking, compassionate man. Well, as we talked about, hypnotherapy is a psychotherapy that has been used. I actually have never used it, and I'm not trained in it. So I would say that it's outside of my expertise to know, does that type of technique pull out this identity? But I can answer some questions about multiple personality disorder, which is we talked about this actually in the first episode we did, Man-Bat, right?
Yeah.
So multiple personality disorder is an outdated term. It's a term that I think most people know about. Fewer people might know about the actual term that's used now for this disorder, which is dissociative identity disorder, DID. DID is actually another. This episode is just full of controversial themes because that particular illness is, sort of controversial in the sense that a lot of people in this field are not quite sure if it's an actual phenomenon.
Right. This is the Loch Ness Monster or the Sasquatch of...
Well...
It's so rarely seen or said to have been seen that people don't know if it really exists, or...
I would say it's just so rare to find this condition without the symptoms maybe being better explained by another condition or a number of other complex conditions. So again, there's just a lot of disagreement with what this might look like.
It seems to have been sort of a late 20th century fad, where suddenly everybody talked about multiple personality disorder and even got it incorrectly identified with like schizophrenia. A lot of people said schizophrenia was multiple personality disorder. For the record, explain.
Oh my gosh.
Or at least say they're not the same.
Right. So having multiple personalities is not a symptom, is not characteristic of schizophrenia.
Gotcha. So that's, for the record, schizophrenia is not multiple personality disorder.
No.
Okay. So it's a very controversial diagnosis. What are we dealing with, though? If this were to exist, how would you classify DID?
Well, okay. So the reason it was changed to dissociative identity disorder is that dissociation is a big part of this problem, in the sense of somebody having a disturbance or a fracture in their awareness, in their consciousness. And sometimes that could include their identity altogether.
So Harvey deciding to cast his anger aside could physically, or rather mentally, he could be fracturing it. He could be creating a trash bin full of his anger that is essentially creating another personality.
There actually is an association between traumatic events and the process of dissociation. So if what he experienced was so difficult for him to process emotionally, he may have begun this process of trying to pull his identity away from that experience. And,
Gotcha.
At a deep level, at a psychological level, yes, that would begin to create a fractured sense of self. That's certainly characteristic of somebody who does not have a stable, solid psychological state for the most part. That could mean that they do have moments where they're not like themselves. Like, you can imagine that people with difficulty experiencing certain emotions like guilt or anger, if they try to avoid them, yes, they are going to have a lot of difficulty just functioning emotionally. So that part of this representation of Harvey seems pretty realistic to me.
Right.
So as I said, DID, again, is famously controversial, but it is in our diagnostic manual as an actual mental health illness, and it's characterized by having multiple alter egos, or what we can say like personal identities, that control an individual's behavior and actions at different times. As we talked about in the Man-Bat episode, this could mean, the different personalities having different characteristics altogether, like different genders, different ages, different hair colors, different, you name it. Like they are seen by the individual, or actually they're experienced by the individual as completely different personas.
Which is why you could have a 50-year-old man also have the personality of a small girl
who wears glasses. Right. And, I know the media has included this in a lot of different stories. And it is true when, at least, in research in the books, there are cases where someone has expressed at least 2 different personalities, which is the minimum you need to meet this diagnosis, up to 100 or more different personalities. So again, people who suffer from this illness could have a whole number of different personalities that are distinct from one another.
So are the personalities typically different sides of them? For instance, with Harvey, you've got the handsome, charismatic, charming politician, and then with Big Bad Harv, you literally have every bit of anger. So if there's a part of him that needs to bring out that side, he has a personality for that. Is that how those personalities tend to work?
Well, again, from the literature, there are some cases where some alter egos or some alters may harbor aggressive tendencies. So, one would say that this is the outlet that this person has to express that aggression and that hostility.
So you could be hostile, or you could be, sexually aggressive, or you could be, just different traits that maybe you as a unit don't feel like you have or want.
Or you may not have allowed yourself to express those emotions.
And they have to come out.
Well, according to the psychiatrist that Harvey Dent is seeing,
He felt very guilty about his angry feelings. So guilty that he hid them deep inside until they became an illness. You, Big Bad Harv, represent these angry feelings.
And, we can talk about the validity of DID in a second. But what I really like about this episode is that the doctor actually says,
Everyone feels anger, and it does no harm, as long as it doesn't result in bad behavior.
That's such a great message. If you can imagine lots of kids, I saw this as a kid, and I don't quite remember that particular message, but now looking back, I think it's a valuable message that it's okay to feel upset and angry and, hostile and jealous and all these sort of negative emotions, but it's how we behave following those feelings that could make us a quote-unquote bad person.
And then she says that if Harvey just comes to terms with that, maybe Big Bad Harv will go away.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is that the belief with multiple personalities or DID that if the patient comes to terms with whatever whatever fractured their identity, that those other identities might dissipate?
Well, the objective of the treatment is to integrate all of the personalities so that a person becomes whole, that they are able to experience and express all of those different feelings, attitudes, beliefs, values in one person, which is fundamentally what therapy is about. You and I, we don't have multiple personalities, to my knowledge, but I don't know.
Well, but that's an interesting question. That's something that I know you and I have talked about in the past, and I think we even brought it up with on Leather Wings a little bit with Man Bat. Isn't one of the problems with dissociative identity disorder is that the identities aren't necessarily aware of one another? Or is it that they're aware of one another but can never meet?
Yes, the idea is that each personality is unaware of the other to the extent that typically a person with this condition wouldn't readily know that they have this until they saw some of these other secondary signs. But yes, those fundamentally, what they show is realistic.
So upon finding out that the plan is to sort of wipe out Big Bad Harv,
I'm going nowhere, Missy. If anyone's leaving, it's Mr. Goody-Good.
And he attacks his therapist the same way that he's attacked his assistant or his campaign man, Carlos, and the thug. he attacks her, and she, of course, brings him out of the state with the snap of her finger, which is a classic. When I snap my fingers, you will no longer be hypnotized.
Yeah.
So go with me on this. Can we blame the therapist for the existence of Two-Face at this point? If Harvey has never really shown signs of this other personality, but let's say he's feeling pressure from his re-election campaign, decides to go to a therapist, she puts him under, and suddenly brings to the surface this other identity. Can we lock her up?
No.
Oh.
You can't.
That's unfortunate.
You said this yourself with the explanation of hypnosis. And the same thing is true for hypnotherapy, in the sense that, like, you really can't force somebody to behave a certain way. Can you suggest that they behave in a certain way? Sure, absolutely. And there is this power dynamic between, a psychiatrist and their patient. There is that power differential where the patient is susceptible and even vulnerable to suggestions by the therapist. She didn't make him behave that way. He was already in the state of Big Bad Harv. He is already a hostile, aggressive, and violent guy.
So if he's arrested and clearly goes through a psychological examination, you couldn't necessarily hold her accountable for bringing up feelings in a persona that didn't otherwise exist in a therapy session. She's not held liable for anything like that.
I can't say for sure, but he
seems like a horror movie.
I know. Well, he already had the signs of this personality there. I mean, we were seeing his visions in his nightmares. We were seeing this hostility.
We don't know how long he's been going to the psychiatrist.
No, you're right. I'm not sure how long. It could be that as soon as he started seeing this psychiatrist, that these problems became even worse.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, he assaults her in the session. He gets up as Big Bad Harv and grabs her. He throws something through the window. It's a violent scene.
Yeah.
And she immediately snaps her fingers. Harvey Dent returns. She sits down. She's clearly, in distress and relieved that Harvey's back. And he looks around and
he has no idea that he's done.
Yeah, he's confused as to why the room is in shambles, and he realizes what had happened, and he's deeply guilty and saddened and ashamed that he did this.
Did I do this?
If you're saying that that DID is so rare, looking at what you've seen just up to this point, is he one of those rare cases, or is it possible that he still has something else? Mm-hmm. I mean, is it that obvious to you?
Well, we often say in this field, when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras.
Is that an American saying? Like, if you're in Africa, can you think zebras and not horses?
Yes.
And
it's absolutely a cultural phrase. Thank you for pointing that out.
If we're in Narnia, can we think Minotaur?
Yes.
Okay.
Think of the most common, most likely diagnosis first, and then, consider some other potential diagnoses as well. And, I admit to this myself. I tend to immediately think of some of the more interesting, rarer types of conditions. And, sometimes those can seem like likely explanations. But if the symptoms can be better explained by another condition, and that other condition is more likely, or is more, has a higher prevalence, we would say, we may want to consider that one as our best diagnosis.
So then what would the second diagnosis potentially be?
Well, let's think about what we know even from the beginning of this episode, that he has these extreme mood states, that he goes from being calm and collected to, in a very short period of time, becoming rageful and hostile and violent. One would say that these aren't discrete moments. These are very commonplace for him, at least in the first, this is what we're seeing in this first part of this episode, that there's this pattern almost of being enraged and going after strangers, picking fights, having physical altercations, assaulting people. Again, that's probably not as typical for people when we get angry. What happens when you get angry? You probably try to process the emotion, and some of us may throw something. Some of us may start yelling.
No!
But each and every time, Harvey Dent really goes to the extreme.
Harv, take it easy.
When I first saw his outburst, I thought that he may have bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is it's a mood disorder. I'm sure, as you've heard, another term for it is manic depression. So it's characterized by having these mood states, sometimes called manic episodes, where you have this drastic change in your mood and your behavior. A lot of times, a manic episode is characterized by feeling, overjoyed and ecstatic and overexcited to the degree that someone is just behaving in a way that's not like themselves. Sometimes being in a manic state means an extreme feeling of irritability and hostility to the point that you get in these fights with people. Like part of the criteria is actually, picking fights with strangers, like getting into fights with strangers. And we see Harvey do this. So seeing that, I would say that might be a better...
Is it just picking fights? Or
No, not at all. And I'm glad that you asked that, because a lot of times people, unfortunately we see this a lot with people saying, oh, I feel so bipolar. I was feeling okay, and then suddenly I'm feeling, super irritable, or I'm super mad all of a sudden.
So clearly you must be bipolar.
I know. I don't want to diminish the reality of and the seriousness and challenges of bipolar disorder. So I want to be very clear that it's not just, in a moment feeling kind of down and then suddenly feeling super happy, or hearing good news and suddenly being overjoyed. Bipolar disorder, or these manic episodes that people experience, are usually happening for long periods of time, sometimes days, where they're in this elevated mood state and they cannot get out of that experience. Like, they're just so elevated that they are not like themselves. And while sometimes it can sound exciting and even enjoyable, like, oh, you're just feeling like super happy, sometimes it's not enjoyable. It can be incredibly uncomfortable and unbearable, and sometimes people feel so agitated and irritated throughout this time that they really need to get help for it. So I don't want to diminish the when I'm talking about Harvey Dent having these explosive outbursts. Certainly that could happen to folks, and they do not have bipolar disorder. But I would think, when we're given the information that we're given, and he's so distraught, and he's having nightmares, and he's clearly suffering, that would be the place I would go to first.
Just to help illustrate to the audience, in the same way that you classified or that you likened borderline disorder to Glenn Close's character in Fatal Attraction in an earlier episode, are there any fictional characters or are there any characters or people that you could associate bipolar disorder to give people a clearer example of what it...
Yeah, there's actually two really good examples of bipolar disorder in film and TV. One is Homeland with... have we talked about this yet on this show?
No, we mentioned it. We mentioned it on Previews Party podcast.
So Homeland is a show that features as its main character this woman, Carrie, who works for the government. It's, I think, the CIA, and it's a really great portrayal of somebody living with bipolar disorder, because it does show the the episodes that she experiences, these manic episodes where, she will be fine for some time and then she'll experience this extreme mood state that's, she just is acting in extreme ways. She's behaving in ways that's not like herself. And she's clearly in distress when that happens, despite the fact that you see her engaging in behavior that might be pleasurable, like, going on dates and hooking up with guys and, drinking
But that
a
actually
lot.
might be a symptom of...
Absolutely.
Like, it's not really pleasurable. We might think of it as pleasurable,
Right.
but for her, it's a manic...
Right. For her, she's seeking these pleasurable activities because she's just in such an excitable, elated state that she needs to engage in these behaviors to feel good.
So what's the other example?
The other one is Silver Linings Playbook, which is a male character with bipolar disorder. And he's showing more of the irritable, angry, hostile types of episodes. And what I like about that film is that, again, it shows him really trying to deal with the mood states, finding that he's able to recognize when they're happening, but he can't control it. And I think that's the piece here that, if anything I wanted to emphasize, it would be going back to Harvey Dent. Everyone around him is noticing his anger and his behavior. And if he truly has bipolar disorder, it's incredibly difficult to control. That he might even find himself feeling revved up, might find himself, with the urge to lash out and having, he may have little control over, over those urges. And he's in an incredible amount of distress there.
Is it one or the other, dissociative identity disorder or bipolar, or could he have both?
Certainly, it really never has to be one or the other. He could certainly have both. And in fact, he could have something else along with it. I think he's a complex character, and it's possible that he's struggling with a number of different conditions, which is why this is just a well-written episode. And one thing I really wanted to point out about this episode is that at the end of this therapy session, the psychiatrist tells Harvey that essentially he needs to be hospitalized, and she really encourages him to admit himself at the inpatient psychiatric ward at County General, which is actually what you would do at this point if you have a patient assault you and clearly be in that level of distress and potentially be threatening either to harm other people or himself. At that point, you would want them to be hospitalized. And unfortunately, he says, no, this is not good for his public reputation. He has this big election coming up. So,
is it something that she can force?
I mean,
Does she have the power to have him hospitalized?
Sure, absolutely. If you can demonstrate that your patient is going to be harmful to themselves or to someone else.
I would point at the broken window. That
she did.
That she
had she did. But there's also this level of collaboration and this level of agreement and working together toward your goal. And at that point, he actually says, "Is there anything else we can do?" And if he says, "No, I'm not going to harm myself. I won't harm other people," she can agree to not admit him, and she says, what would you be interested in increasing our sessions and cutting down on your campaign, like cutting down the time you spent on your campaign and spending more time in therapy? And he agrees to that, which again is another good direction for this professional clinician. So this is a really nice representation of how a patient would be treated.
So he leaves the office. We jump to election night. It looks like Harvey is going to win by a landslide, and he gets a phone call from his arch nemesis, Rupert Thorne, who's been the villain that he's been going after for so long. And Thorne has something on him. He knows about Big Bad Harv because his right-hand lady happened to be listening outside. He knows all about Dent's secret identity.
Candace, his one of his lady thugs.
His lieutenant of sorts.
She actually is, we see her at the end of his psychiatry session, we see that Candace is eavesdropping outside the door. That's a little weird. I don't know how, at any facility or office, how anyone would have allowed that. But nonetheless, she actually manages to steal his chart.
Yeah. So Thorne's got it, and he offers a deal. Basically, you're in my pocket, or I reveal to the world that Big Bad Harv exists. And Harvey leaves to meet with Thorne. Batman is hot on his heels because clearly it's odd that he's leaving what would essentially be his celebration party, his victory party, early. And even says, are you in trouble? And he said, more than you can possibly imagine. So Batman follows him, thank goodness, because we then see Thorne is basically manipulating the situation, and he's working Harvey up to a nice lather, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what I find interesting. This is actually why I bring up the hypnosis thing again. Thorne flips a coin, and it's a trigger. Suddenly, Harvey goes from a man who is fighting the Big Bad Harv persona from coming to the surface,
mm-hmm.
and then calmly becomes Big Bad Harv. Like that trigger, almost, as if hypnotic,
mm-hmm.
brings him to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And then says, well, the bad news for you is that you're talking to the wrong Harvey.
Right.
And he attacks Thorne and his men. Batman interrupts him, and they have the classic brawl that has to come at the end of one of these episodes, which then ends basically as they are, as Thorne is running away from Harvey. Harv goes after him, and one of the other thugs is about to shoot Harv in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Batman stops him, but the gun ends up hitting an electrical junket, which then blows up a vat of... they've always got chemicals and vats of things in the city.
Of course, they're in a giant warehouse
Always.
Full of giant vats of toxic
Stuff.
Chemical garbage that... is the stuff villains are made of.
Literally. There's a big explosion. Harvey is caught in that explosion.
Harvey. No.
Mm-hmm.
And he is then taken immediately to the hospital by Batman. We see him bandaged. And unfortunately, he is told that he may require plastic surgery.
Mm-hmm.
That there will clearly be physical scarring.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce, however, says...
I'm more worried about the mental scars.
Which, clearly we are too. I guess leading up to this point, Harvey Dent was the dominant personality trying to suppress Big Bad Harv.
Mm-hmm.
Big Bad Harv was currently in control at the time of the explosion, and now Big Bad Harv from this point on seems to be the dominant personality constantly trying to suppress Harvey Dent as Two-Face. But we'll get into that as we go into a second part. But later on, the bandages are removed in a scene that is a little too closely resembling the 1989 Tim Burton Batman, where the Joker, Jack Napier, is all under bandages, and you got the plastic surgeon and says, "You have to understand. Look what I have to work with."
That was great.
And then, thank you. And then, the Joker's like, mirror, and looks in the mirror, and the only difference between the two scenes is that, besides the fact that Harvey's in a legit hospital, is the fact that while the Joker laughs at the image in the mirror, Harvey screams. And runs out of the room. With lightning behind him, just as Grace is walking up to visit with a flower.
Yeah, I mean the animators and the writers do this really nice job of portraying his his disfigurement and the horror of it. And so what we see is he runs out of his hospital room, and Grace, his fiancée, is actually approaching. She's walking through the hallway with flowers, and she's, clearly there to visit him. And she comes across him in this dark corridor with this giant window, and lightning hits. And it's interesting because she sees him, and his good face, or his
handsome
face, is facing her. That side of his face is toward her. And then as the lightning hits, he turns to look at her, and she sees his disfigurement, and is horrified. And it's like I said, it's such a powerful, jolting scene. That moment where we see Two-Face as Two-Face, and that's actually where the episode ends.
Is Harvey Dent the Incredible Hulk of the DC universe?
He might be. Although, does Bruce Banner have a conscious awareness of the Hulk? He might.
He's aware of him, and he certainly tries to suppress him.
Right, but when he's the Hulk, is he aware of Bruce Banner? Like, does he have DID?
Some of the writers treat it differently. Sometimes he is aware, and sometimes he wakes up and he's got shredded purple pants and lots of destruction around him.
Right.
So maybe he is. Maybe we'll do a crossover episode one day, or not. Okay, so we have covered a lot of ground here. There's been a lot of psychological education going down. Right now, it's the end of part 1, and we're a little on the fence. Is he DID? Is he bipolar disorder? Is he what's going on? Will the scarred face traumatize him further? Will it lock in Big Bad Harv as the dominant personality? We're honestly going to cover that next week. We're also going to cover your questions. We asked on Twitter and on Facebook for you, the audience, to submit your questions about Two-Face. Well, now we're here. Now we're at Two-Face. So he now exists. We can now cover those questions. We're going to do that next week.
If you're interested in learning more about bipolar disorder or dissociative identity disorder, look up the National Alliance on Mental Illness, as well as the National Institute of Mental Health online. That both those websites have a lot of descriptions and resources that are very helpful to explain much more in depth about some of the things that we talked about today.
Awesome. So until next week, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
the ARKHAM Sessions. He wakes up from his dream and he's just sweating. He wakes up in this panic attack. He's completely distressed and distraught by this dream.
Yeah, so we find out through, I don't know if it's his personal assistant or his campaign manager. He sort of seems to have job descriptions of both. But this gentleman comes in, tells Harvey that they're going on a raid. Now, why the district attorney is there for the raid, I don't really know. But the GCPD are going after these guys who are fighting back with a vengeance. They've even got rocket launchers. And Batman comes in and, of course, saves the day. But in his opportunity to get in front of the camera, Harvey, of course, praises Gotham City's police department, Commissioner Gordon especially. Harvey mentions that
I will not rest until Gotham City has been dethorned once and for all.
So you're right. He's absolutely got a great deal of pressure on him, and we start to see him break a little bit because one of the thugs had paranoia, and there was even bipolar disorder. All of that we can certainly get into as we go on, which we can do now. This episode was the 10th. in the two-parter. It was the 10th episode, first aired September 25th, 1992. When we're introduced to Harvey, it's actually through a nightmare.
Right. The episode opens up with this dark scene. Harvey is alone, sort of distraught. He's hearing this voice.
Harvey Dent.
And we start to see the signature coin flip. At the time, it's not signature to us if we're going by the episode.
Right, we've not seen anything
Yeah.
like that before.
Yeah.
But in this dream, he approaches this dark figure who's in the shadows. You can't really quite make out who he is, but you see this hand come out and he flips a coin, and apparently that gesture is, incredibly frightening to Harvey.
You can't get away from me.
Oh my God, I couldn't be any more excited for this episode.
I'm doubly excited.
Good, because that's appropriate. Because we are talking about Two-Face.
One of my favorite villains of all time.
And the best thing about this episode, from my perspective, is that it's the first time in the episodes that we've covered so far that we are seeing a legitimate origin story.
Mm-hmm.
So I am very excited. I know you're excited. This is part one of a two-parter. We are going to do part two next week. So let's jump into part one right now. First, let's talk about Two-Face a little bit.
Sure.
Two-Face is a character who's been around since the 40s. He was actually introduced in Detective Comics number 66. Bill Finger and Bob Kane created him. In the summer of 1942, he made his first appearance. Now, this was a character, I'll give a little bit of backstory on his origins then versus what we're going to talk about in the animated series. Two-Face was originally, well, in his first appearance, he was Harvey Kent, but it was a little too close to Clark, so he's changed to Harvey Dent. But Harvey was the district attorney who was prosecuting the mob boss, Sal Maroney, and Sal threw acid in his face, thus scarring half of his face and turning him into one of Batman's arch nemesis. At the time, he wasn't so much... he wasn't a big part of Batman's rogues gallery. In fact, he only made 3 appearances in the 40s. Mm-hmm. In his third appearance, actually, he was cured. His scarring was, his disfigurement was fixed, and he was cured of his insanity, which kind of makes him a really boring villain. So we didn't see him again until the 50s. Really, he only made a couple appearances in the 50s. It wasn't until the 1970s with Denny O'Neil that he came in and actually solidified himself as a member of the Rogues Gallery. And really, it wasn't until Batman Year One, written by Frank Miller, where we get a little bit of backstory that we continue to see in Batman the Animated Series, and that is that he is good friends with both Bruce Wayne and Commissioner Gordon, which sort of makes him that much more tragic when he becomes a villain, and now Batman and Commissioner Gordon are having to go after their old friend.
Right.
And then after Year One, Andrew Helfer, the writer, actually introduced sort of an alcoholic and abusive father in Harvey's past, and there was even mentions of early kind of struggles with, there was